all the science and all the data on spirituality shows that having positive spiritual beliefs or constructive spiritual practices helps healing from all sorts of mental illnesses as well as physical illnesses.
Today's conversation is with Dr. Anna Yusim. Dr. Yusim has helped over 2,000 people in 60 countries achieve greater impact, purpose, and joy in their life and work. She's an internationally recognized, award-winning, board-certified, Stanford and Yale-educated psychiatrist and executive coach with a private practice in New York City and Connecticut. She's also the best-selling author of a book called Fulfilled: How the Science of Spirituality Can Help You Live a Happier, More Meaningful Life, which is in large part the focus of our discussion today. She's on the clinical faculty at Yale Medical School and is presently creating a spirituality and mental health center at Yale. Her clients include Forbes 500 CEOs, Olympic athletes, A-list actors and actresses, and the chairs of academic departments at top universities. But one of the many things I love about Dr. Yusim is her unique and wide-ranging background. Coming from a family of mathematicians and growing up studying math and science for much of her life, in fact, thinking she was going to become a mathematician herself, she went on to work as a neurobiology researcher and completed her studies at Stanford, Yale Medical School, and the NYU Psychiatry Residency Training Program. But it was around that time that Dr. Yusim felt something was missing from her life. In her quest to find it, she bumped up against what felt like the limitations of her psychiatric and medical training. And over the next few years, she traveled to, lived in, and worked in over 70 countries while studying Kabbalah, learning Buddhist meditation, and working with South American shamans and Indian gurus. In this amazing conversation, we discussed the intersection between and importance of both neuroscience and spirituality on our mental health, on our physical health, and even on our longevity. You know, there's been a ton of research published in recent years that shows a direct link between spiritual beliefs, having spiritual beliefs, and more years lived. We also talk about the 4 different ways that human beings process emotions and which are the most destructive and which one is the most useful and empowering. We talk about the ways achievement-oriented people tend to process emotions specifically, and the good and difficult parts of that. And we also talk about the cutting edge new research on psychedelic medicine. Dr. Yusim is a vanguard in this space and how it affects both medical health and the relationship people have with spiritual concepts and beliefs. The importance of what Dr. Yusim describes as heart-opening experiences to living a rich and meaningful life. And she also provides examples of exactly how to begin exploring more of this today in your own life. So without further ado, here is Dr. Anna Yusim. All right, so there's so much that I'm excited to talk about. You have really a remarkable background, and you also have a profound amount of work that you're engaging in, consistently between the books you've written and are writing, films, your private practice, the center that you're building, and so much more. And so I'm excited to talk about all of that. But I do have a question up front that I just have to ask. In my experiences with you, and we've had several conversations offline, you and I also have a few mutual friends who have shared this as well. And in all the interviews, even in the book, when I was reading your book, I sort of felt this. You have a remarkable energy about you, a really positive, seemingly boundless optimism and just positivity and just an ability to look at the world through what seems to be very clear eyes. And so my question is, have you always had that? Where do you think it comes from? Do you cultivate that? And if so, how? And how do you hold that? I mean, I certainly have moments like that, but you just have really amazing energy, and to hear about it.
Well, thank you so much, Nate. That is such a compliment, especially coming from you. And I feel as though, first of all, it comes from my father, who's also such an optimist, despite being through so much in his life. We are from Russia. We had to, my father, when we left Russia, I was 4 years old, turning 5 at the time. He had to deal with a lot of anti-Semitism. There was a lot of challenge. His mother got sick when he was relatively young. And yet he has this amazing, boundless optimism and has had that his whole life. So I think genetically I get a little bit of that from him, but it's not to say it's not something that I don't have to work at. I have to work at it very much because life is very challenging. And this is despite all the joy that is in life. And that's one part of optimism, is appreciating the joy, really sinking into the joy, recognizing all that you have, being grateful for all the gifts in your life. And everyone has those, no matter who you are, no matter what your life entails. We all have gifts, but it's also, how do you deal with the suffering? How do you deal with the pain of your life? And how do you alchemize that, transmute that, find meaning in that, and do whatever you need to do to enable you to move on with your life with a smile, with energy, with optimism, and using your own challenges, difficulties in order to help other people overcome theirs, to use your own pain to uplift others. And I think that that's been, and my life certainly has not been without pain. It has had plenty of pain, as much as anybody else's life, if not more. And I think that at the root of that, I've had to learn how to transmute that, because ultimately my goal in this world is to help elevate human consciousness, uplift human beings, help other people with their own pain. And I'd be a fraud and an imposter if that wasn't something that I was constantly working on in my own life as well.
You know, I'm familiar with a concept called cognitive reappraisal, but I think what I'm hearing you describe is like, you know, taking those painful moments in life and pulling out a different meaning from them, or reappraising what they actually mean. And I certainly have gone through periods in my own life where I'm sitting with something that's painful and I'm not reappraising it in a positive way. And I've certainly observed that in, you know, colleagues and friends and family that are just holding on to something painful and and haven't yet reached that point where they've reappraised it. Do you think that process is a fundamental part of what it means to live a good life, a rich life, and have a perspective that's optimistic and meaningful?
Absolutely. I think that's a huge, huge part of it. So cognitive reappraisal is being able to see things anew, to see your challenges in new light, to be able to see the good and the diamond, even in the pain. And all pain has diamonds. All things have parts of them from which we can learn, from which we could pull out the good and elevate our own consciousness and help others, right? So that's, I think, a huge part of cognitive reappraisal. And for some people, that alone is enough, starting to see their life anew. But people are all very different. And for some people, it's the emotions. They even can begin to start to cognitively reappraise and yet get constantly drawn into sadness, into an old story that brings up so much emotion that just drags them down. So I think that's the other part of, you have to learn how to work with your thoughts, which is cognitive reappraisal. Then you have to learn how to work with your emotions, and not only allow yourself to feel the difficult emotions, pain, anger, fear, grief, whatever that is, that the situation that creates suffering has brought up, but also to then let go of that, to learn how to let go, and then to fill that void of emotion with positive emotions. I think that's the other part, in addition to the cognitive reappraisal, is working with your emotions in constructive ways, feeling everything that comes up, never pushing it away, because ultimately what we resist persists. And yet we as humans are always pushing away negative emotions and wanting to bring in more positive ones, but we can't escape our pain. Our pain is just an inescapable part of everyday life. And the more we allow ourselves to feel it and to be whole, the more we're able to then start to let it go and create space for the positive emotions that come alongside the cognitive reappraisal. And there's many, many ways to get positive emotions, including gratitude, including forgiveness practices, including opening your heart to love, including certain meditations, connecting with people with whom you feel, deep kinship. So I think those two things together, the thoughts and the emotions. And then I would add one other thing to that is behaviors, figuring out what steps to take, taking the so-called proper action so that you can have the best life possible, and tie up the loose ends of the suffering of the past as much as you can. So cognitive reappraisal is at the level of thought. And then we add to that emotions and behaviors. And then we have our little trilogy of how we can move forward with grace and with optimism in our lives.
Yeah, I think, I mean, and also, it really, there is something powerful about letting go, the two abilities of letting go, and then sort of cultivating something different. All right. So listen, there's probably a number of people listening to our conversation that might not be familiar with your work. So before we go any further, I thought maybe we could start with one of the things I'd ultimately love to talk more about later, which is this center that you are now really focused on and excited about. Can you describe the intention behind it, what it is? And then what I'd love to do is talk about how it came to be, your background, and how some of this came into view. So,
yes. Thanks, Nate. So yes, I am starting a mental health and spirituality center at Yale. I myself went to Yale Medical School, and then I did my residency and took many years off to be a practicing psychiatrist, during which spirituality entered my life. If you had told me I was going to be a spiritual person 15, 20 years ago, I would have laughed. But it came into my life, took me by storm, and became a very, very central ingredient to my life. And when I say came into my life, things started happening in my life that the traditional scientific explanation that I used to explain how the world works just didn't make sense. So I had to look for other explanations. And I started looking at this concept of the soul and of spirit, concepts that you really don't learn in medical school or in residency training. And I became so interested in this concept, I eventually wrote a book at the intersection of science and spirit called Fulfilled. And it came out in 2017, 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago. And when I was doing my book tour, I went to Yale, where I'd done my medical schooling, and they said, you know what, we like your book. We want you to come on our clinical faculty. I was thrilled to do that. And I'd actually gone out of my way not to affiliate with an academic institution. I just wanted to be free, and I wanted to be able to think freely, to be able to write my book and not feel in any way encumbered as I put forth what I needed to put forth in the world. So I was thrilled when Yale had that response. And their second response was, and let's think together about creating a mental health and spirituality center. It's a conversation that I had with Bob Rohrbach, who's been one of my mentors in this. So I was thrilled to do that. I started knocking on a few doors, and I got the sense pretty early on, around 2017, Yale is not ready. This is not the time for the center. So I put it aside and then kept living my life, kept doing my practice. And then I started following the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, who is a meditation expert. And I was sitting in one of his meditation retreats and doing one of these amazing group meditations with 1,000 people that are so powerful. And I get this little message download: the time for your center is now, and Dr. Joe could be one of your partners. And I'm like, okay, time to start the center. So then I went back and started knocking on the exact same doors that I knocked on 5 years ago. And this time the doors flew wide open. Yale was ready. The chair of the Department of Psychiatry was very excited. He called a meeting of some other psychiatrists. This is an important initiative. Please support Anna in this. I was thrilled. And then Dr. Christopher Pittenger, who is one of the psychedelics researchers and neuroscience researchers at Yale. He's head of the psychedelics research program. And he himself did his PhD with Eric Kandel, the only living Nobel Prize winner in psychiatry, who he did at Columbia. So he's absolutely, Christopher is absolutely brilliant. And so he came on board to co-lead the center with me. So we are putting this forth. It's a relatively new initiative. And right now we're raising money for the creation of that. The idea is that it's going to be the first center to bridge the School of Divinity and the School of Medicine. And we're going to put forth everything that needs to be put forth to make that happen. And it's going to focus on research, clinical work, as well as education. The research is going to be research at the intersection of mental health and spirituality, which includes many, many things, including the power of meditation in overcoming depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, addiction, the power of psychedelics, and especially the spiritual side of psychedelics use to help with mental illness. It's going to focus on the fine line between being psychic and being psychotic, and where, that divide is. It's going to focus on resiliency and the importance of spirituality and overcoming stress response and resilience, and much, much more. And so the research portion is the first portion that we're getting set up, and eventually the clinical portion, where we're going to use this research in the treatment of patients at Yale and beyond, and then education with conferences and many other activities throughout Yale and around the world to be able to focus on our subject matter. So this is what we're doing now. And this is the center that I am very actively working on.
That's really exciting. All right. So let's set a little groundwork here. So your traditional or your initial training early on was where? Can you start at the beginning a little bit with your
Yes. So I was born in Russia, grew up in Chicago, went to high school at the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy, which is a public residential school, studied math and science. Thought I was going to be a mathematician. My whole family, I come from a whole family of mathematicians, went to Stanford for undergrad, started studying math there. I would spend hours and hours. I was such a nerd. I would spend hours doing math contest problems and loved it. This is how I would spend my free time. And it made me so happy. Went to Stanford. All of the TAs there were from different countries. So very few of them spoke English. And suddenly my passion for math dwindled. And around that time, I discovered the books of Irvin Yalom, this brilliant existential psychiatrist. And I thought, I want to be just like you. I want to see patients and I want to write their stories with as much depth and sensitivity as Dr. Yalom. And so that's the path that I pursued. I took a few years off, was a management consultant, did my medical schooling at Yale, then did my residency at NYU in New York City, started my practice at NYU, worked there for about 12 years before COVID struck, and then moved to rural Connecticut and have continued everything by telehealth.
Yes, telehealth has really saved us. So that makes a lot more sense. So you really have a very significant background, educational background. In what I love about your background is that there's, something so sort of fundamental and incredibly scientific and practical about mathematics. And ultimately you've wandered into much different territory, which gives you, I think, a unique perspective. In your book, there is a passage that I'd like to just read, and then if you could talk a little bit about this in more specifics, which speaks to your personal or your private practice, which I understand you've seen over 1,000 patients. Is that true?
2,000 at this point.
2,000 patients. Okay, great. The passage is my own personal life and my work with more than 1,000 at the time patients in my private practice in New York City has taught me something very important about the healing process. True healing and lasting fulfillment require a spiritual transformation as well as a clinical outcome. So could you just talk a little bit about what that experience was like? Like, what were you attempting at first and what was working? And then or I'm sure it was probably a series of things that brought you to the conclusion that something more was needed. And what did you do?
Absolutely. Such a great question, Nate. And so, it really started with my own personal journey, because at the end of the day, we are passing on to everybody that which we are able to give ourselves, right? And we can only take our patients or clients as far as we ourselves have gone. So that's why I think it's so important for healers, for psychologists, therapists, any kind of, coaches, et cetera, to do their own work and keep breaking through their own boundaries. And for me, that boundary came around residency when I had entered my own so-called dark night of the soul. I had was dating somebody, found out that he was dating many other people, and then was devastated by that. And at the same time, residency just was not going well. It was not feeling aligned for so many different reasons. And all of those things together led me into this downward spiral. Should I even be doing this? Do I need to be doing something else? And then I used the tools of my profession, which is psychiatry, to try to pull myself out, but felt some limitations in that. And what I actually found myself being drawn to, which I'd never been drawn to before, was the spiritual side of life, and starting to ask questions about, because of this person that I was with, I thought was my soulmate. So this idea of a soul, we don't really learn about souls. We don't really, think about that in medical school and residency so much. And first going into the tools of my own profession, therapy, I found myself a little limited. And I'm like, okay, well, I need to learn how to pull myself out of this, because if I'm going to be helping other people in this profession, I need to first be successful in transforming my own pain. And so two things happened. I then got an amazing new therapist analyst who really did start to help me. And I started traveling the world, starting to understand this concept of soul and starting to understand what healing meant in all these different communities, cultures, countries of the world, and how it was different from how we define healing. And I ended up spending time in ashrams in India, going to Israel to learn about Kabbalah, working with shaman in South Africa and South America, and spending, time in Thailand to learn Buddhist meditation. And all of these things were so profoundly healing for me in completely different ways than Western medicine is healing. And it really enabled me to have my own spiritual transformation, really just a complete shift in perspective as to what is a human being? What is life? What is the soul? And if I were to describe that spiritual transformation, it's the spiritual transformation that goes from the scientific world, where everything that you see is 100% of reality, that we live in this empirical universe, and that the way that we know what's real is by seeing it, touching it, and measuring it, to the world of Kabbalah and other mystical worlds, where actually what you see in this external world is only 1% of reality. And there is so much more buried deep within that is not necessarily seen, touched, or heard, and not necessarily empirical. And so it was blending these two worlds and having that huge perceptual shift for me. That was a huge part of my healing. And so with patients, that was my spiritual transformation. Everybody's is different in the healing process, but ultimately that spiritual transformation entails a huge perception shift that enables them to broaden how they see the world and their place in it.
And Anna, real quickly, how long were you traveling? How long was this world tour? I mean, did you set out initially with the main objective of, I'm going to go heal myself, and I'm going to go wherever I have to heal myself? Or was part of the intention really to bring back tools for the practice as well? And, and how long were you gone? I mean, it sounds like you literally went all around the world.
I did go all around the world, but it wasn't so simple to say, I'm going to go all around the world. It was, I'm a resident with a full-time job with a lot of patients who are depending on me, and I have a very, very busy schedule, and I need to fit these trips in during my vacations, during times off, so this was over the course of the last 3 years of my residency and the year after, in little bits and pieces whenever I could. And the motivation was, of course, I was in a huge learning, growth, expansion phase. I wanted to learn everything I possibly could about my profession and other forms of healing. But it was really motivated by, I'm on some level at the soul level in deep pain, and I need to figure out how to transform that. And so that was really the primary driver. Pain is such a powerful driver. That's what leads people to grow oftentimes. That's why people come to my door. That's why people begin coaching. But pain doesn't have to be the only driver. Pain is the reactive way of growth. There's also the proactive way of growth. When you realize that you want to grow, then you make choices. What do I need to do to consciously challenge myself and go against my nature to grow proactively, so that I don't have to grow so much reactively or through pain? So,
I mean, it sounds like you took something important from each of these experiences. Was there any one of these trips that was particularly profound, or that really unlocked something more deeply for you? Or
they were all so profound. I can't even begin to, describe. I mean, I certainly can, okay. So first is this idea of soul, right? So my whole idea in going was also, I need to understand what this whole soul thing is and why I was never taught about this soul, which is it a distinct thing from the mind and the body? Is it all integrated? What is the soul? So I would ask people all over the world. And my favorite definition of soul came from a Mexican shaman named Fernando Broca. And he defined the soul as being comprised of two parts. The first part is that which connects us to everybody and everything. So people often say we're one unified soul, and that's what they mean. The second part of soul is that which encapsulates your unique skills, talents, abilities, life purpose, mission. And so that which only you can bring to the world that no one else can. And so our soul in this way is both parts, our uniqueness and our interconnectedness to everybody else. And so I love that definition. That somehow really resonated with me.
Before you came to this realization and decided, like, I'm going to go venture out and try to find answers that are beyond what I have at my disposal based on my current education, were you a more practical person
Totally.
And I guess, did you have a religious upbringing? Were you religious in any way, or were you spiritual before you started this journey? Or was there and I'm not trying to project on you, but in my own experience, my spirituality has certainly shifted. And there were phases where it was, I was a lot more open and curious. And there were phases when I was a lot more closed. So what was your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Similar to yourself. So to go back to my childhood, my dad was a physics professor, biomedical engineer, super, super rational, not particularly spiritual, but very connected to my religion, which is Judaism, but more because of culture and because of what he and his parents had to endure in Russia as Jews. So really connected to that part of the Jewish identity. My mother has always been a spiritual seeker. So in a way, my now becoming a spiritual seeker, there's also, I'm sure, a genetic basis for that. But she was always seeking in Judaism, but also outside of the religion. She was always reading about, Hare Krishna, about this, about that. She was just very interested always. This was her thing. But I always grew up much more like my dad, super, super rational, until this time in my life where I feel like I just opened and this curiosity popped, and it popped right as I was finishing up my residency training, about to become a doctor, about to go into this world with healing tools. And so in a way, it was a completely unanticipated turn that my life took to then become a spiritual person. And now with spirituality being central to my life. And it's one of those things I never could have imagined or anticipated. And then you wonder now, you look at your life and the trajectory of your life seems pretty straight and pretty clear. And then you're like, but no, there were things on my past trajectory that completely veered me off my path. What could happen now that can do that? And then you're like, you welcome that. You're like, I welcome some really cool new mind opening, heart opening thing to come. So it's just an interesting thing.
Especially the heart opening. I want to talk more about. I'm imagining that, for anyone that's listening to this, that might be at a different place in their spiritual journey, let's say, that may either just be unsure of how to connect with a sense of spirituality, or maybe in one of those places where they're just not as open or not as connected. There's a passage in your book that really grabbed me, and as it relates to this, and I'd love to hear your reaction to it. Is it okay if I read it? All right. So by the law of conservation of energy cannot be created or destroyed. It simply changes form. The amount of energy in the universe is constant. Energy can be changed, moved, controlled, stored, or dissipated. However, it cannot be created from nothing or reduced to nothing. In essence, atoms are immortal. They never die. Although the forms and structures that atoms create eventually come apart and, quote, die, the individual atoms themselves reconfigure, change form, and live on. Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk and peace activist, discusses how modern day concepts of death defy the law of conservation of energy. The concept of death is that being turns into non-being. That is impossible. Can someone become nobody? No. If we burn a piece of paper, we cannot reduce it to nothing. The paper will turn into heat, which will go into the cosmos, and turn into smoke, which will join the clouds in the sky. Tomorrow, a drop of rain will fall on your forehead, and you will make contact with the piece of paper. The ashes produced by the burning will rejoin earth, and one day they will manifest as daisies. It's a beautiful passage. What made you write it, and how does this relate to your sense of spirituality?
Yeah. So in my book, it's divided into 3 sections. The first section is authenticity. The second section is soul corrections, or those lessons that our souls have come into this world to learn, or those challenges our souls have come to correct. And then the third part, where you read the passage from, is about connecting to part of something greater. And as I was thinking about connecting to part of something greater, I was like, what comprises that? What is something greater made up of? And so I thought, it's made up of our consciousness. So there's a chapter on consciousness. It's made up of this idea of immortality, which is where I think this is from the immortality chapter, this idea that matter is not created or destroyed, that we are always living on, every part of us is living on in all these different ways, not just in this idea of a transcendent soul, but more physically, as through atoms, and that everything that we are will become something else, but it will never become nothing. We never go into non-being, just different forms of being. Energy changes, and therefore matter changes. And then the other parts of something greater were synchronicity, the little magic and miracles of life, and how that in a way connects us to the cosmos and connects us to some, our guidance. We could be guided to that we're making the right decision when a number of synchronicities come and you're just like this way, or when something is not working out despite our best effort over and over and over. What's the lesson we're supposed to learn? What guidance are we supposed to get from that? Are we supposed to change our path, try harder, or elevate our consciousness and then try again with much less resistance? And then, so consciousness, synchronicity, immortality, and the last one was interconnectedness, another part of something greater. This idea that we're all connected to one another in ways that often we don't anticipate. Or I've had this with patients where I have a dream about a patient, or they'll have a dream about me. How could they have known, things that end up being very true? Or one time I had a patient who I was on a Kabbalah trip in the Ukraine, and I woke up in the middle of the night and feeling this extreme panic. And I've never had anything like that. Something was really wrong. And I felt compelled to check my email at the time. And a patient had literally emailed me a minute prior to my waking up, letting me know that he was feeling suicidal. So I was 5,000 miles and 7 time zones away. And yet somehow I got this message and was able to then call my patient in real time and literally and figuratively talk him off the ledge. And what would have happened had I not woken up? Maybe he would have been just fine, or maybe he wouldn't have been, so it's this interconnectedness. So those are those 4 concepts: consciousness, immortality, interconnectedness, and synchronicity that to me were encapsulated in part of something greater.
All right. So your path was really mental health initially, and then it led you to spirituality, and then ultimately the connection between the two. What do you think, from your perspective, having seen thousands of patients and having, so much hands-on experience, what is the importance of spirituality in anyone's mental health? Why do you feel like it's such a key part of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all the science and all the data on spirituality shows that having positive spiritual beliefs or constructive spiritual practices helps healing from all sorts of mental illnesses as well as physical illnesses. And I've also found in my practice, when people are open to spirituality and when we're able to add a little bit of a spiritual dimension, or a lot, if the patient and the executive for my coaching is open and willing, if they're able to add that, the work progresses faster, more thoroughly, and we're able to go much deeper. And, to give you some of the statistics for addiction, for instance, a belief in spirituality or a belief in a higher power is one of the things that leads to the enlightenment that often enables people to, or the awakening that enables people to let go of an addictive experience. And addiction, as well as palliative care, these are the 2 places in medicine where a spiritually based model is actually the medical standard of care. Addiction, because AA and the AA model, which is surrendering to a higher power, is fundamentally one of the medical bases of addiction treatment. But this is also the case with overcoming cancer. People who attended church were less likely to have heart attacks. There's these fascinating studies, and they're very, very potent, very powerful. And having powerful constructive beliefs about why bad things happen to good people, why we suffer, and life-affirming ideas of what it means to live a good life and how to live a healthy life. These things are often part of spiritual practices and spiritual communities. And when people have that, they're able to heal much more thoroughly.
Yeah. And isn't it true that the research shows, I believe the longevity research shows that people literally live longer if they have a belief in some sort of higher power or a sense of purpose, which in many cases is tied to a sense of spirituality. Isn't
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Absolutely. Because I think that's, what makes for a good life. Like you're talking about the Rich Life podcast, abundance in all aspects of life, and purpose and meaning are a huge, huge part. Having an understanding of why difficult things happen in life, all of which many spiritual beliefs provide, being able to surrender, being able to partner with a higher power, being able to know that you're not alone in this world, being able to project sometimes your needs, if those needs can't be met on your own, on something that could potentially help you and therefore open yourself up to that guidance. That's what leads to miracles. That's what leads to healing.
In addition to spirituality, from your perspective, what are the cornerstones of I'll use the word rich, but the richness of life, a deeply fulfilled and meaningful life? What else comes into play there that's really important?
Yeah, I think, I love, as I was listening to the trailer for your podcast, richness in all aspect of life. And I think about what makes my life rich. And it's, first of all, connection, deep connection and community with people that you love, and all the emotions that engenders. Sometimes difficult emotions, of course, because when we love people, we are always renegotiating our boundaries. We're, dealing with conflicts. We're figuring all this out. But also so much love and so much closeness, connection, ascension, being able to share, being able to open your heart with another person, being able to be seen, holding space for others, being able to celebrate holidays with the people that you love, things like that. So connection, I would put all the way at the top.
Yeah.
And I think good health. If you don't have good health, everything else suffers. And so it's something that you want to be grateful for every day, never take for granted, and then do everything you can to make sure that your health is good in terms of your diet, in terms of your lifestyle, taking good care of yourself, getting your sleep, doing whatever that it means to you to feel good every day to the best of your ability. And of course, people have conditions. The world has a lot of illness. COVID happened. Those things happen. And even despite that, what do you do in order to feel good and to be as healthy as you possibly can be? So connection, health, purpose is next. And purpose comes in so many flavors, sizes, everything. Purpose could be being a mother, being a father, being a parent, being able to help so many people overcome their challenges in life, being, CEO of a company, being an employee in a company, basically whatever you're doing it with purpose and meaning, such that you are not just going to work and dialing in, like phoning it in, but really doing the best that you possibly can do with wherever you are and whatever you're doing. So that creates a sense of purpose. And that's also that sense of connecting to something greater. I would, of course, add spirituality to, that list of what do you need for a rich life, and feeling like you're not alone in this world, feeling that you are partnering together with a higher power, whatever that power means to you, whether it's God, the universe, or even a set of transcendent values, that you are living with something greater than yourself. And yes, those are, I think, four parts of abundance, but there's so much more. I also think about caviar and champagne. That's abundance too. The luxuries of life, deliciousness, like being able to savor life's pleasures.
Yeah, totally. I even think about first of all, I love those four. And I really, really agree that connection is a big one there. I also think about things that are just practical day to day. Like if someone loves themselves enough to take care of their house and take care of their environment. Like you think about people that take pride in their setting of life, the desk that they work at or the room that they live in or whatever. I mean, there's simple things like that are a reflection of the love that we have for ourselves, which in turn is the love that we can give to other people. What do you think gets in the way of this? You mentioned actually something that I did want to ask you about, which is addiction. In your book, you talk about addiction in 3 ways: substance addiction, behavioral addiction, and psychological addiction. And I think about this a lot because I actually was just thinking and writing about this yesterday. But, when we have difficult experiences, pandemics, economic contractions are some of the things that I think a lot of people think about right now, but anything that as we go through life, there's so many distractions. There's so many temptations just to numb and suppress and avoid. But of course that doesn't heal really. It just delays at some level. So anyway, could you talk a little bit about addictions from your perspective, and then anything else that you think gets in the way of abundance?
Absolutely. I love it. And I love what you're saying about set and setting and how self-love, the space that you create for yourself, the life you live ultimately is a reflection of you and who you are at the deepest level. And that it's all these little choices and micro choices. Even when we don't realize we're making choices, we are choosing to surround ourselves, with certain people in certain environments. Of course, sometimes it's not a choice, but often it is a choice, at least of how you respond. If not, the whole set and setting idea. And yes, addictions. So addictions are a very powerful form of escape. I'll tell you, first talk about addictions and then talk about the 4 different ways that we can process addictions, one of which is, or not addictions, emotions, one of which is escape, which is what can lead us to addictions. Perfect. And yes, so with addictions, we are familiar with substance addictions. We're familiar even with behavioral addictions, being addicted to your cell phone, sex addictions, workaholism, all forms of behavioral addictions. What people are less familiar with is these so-called psychological addictions, which is addictions to money, power, status, fame, success, achievement, things of that nature, right? And it's all those things that we want and are hailed in society. And none of them are bad. And actually, very few of the substances that people are addicted to are inherently bad. Methamphetamines maybe, but like the majority of things, really, like a glass of wine here and there is not a bad thing. Addiction happens when, especially psychological addiction, when the more of something you have, the emptier you feel. So that's how I would define a psychological addiction. Yeah. So you want to achieve and achieve and achieve. And if it's making you feel great, enjoy. But you get to a point sometimes where you keep achieving and you've already maxed out. There's something else that you need and you're continuing to achieve only to fill the void. So what is this void you're filling and how do you fill it in more constructive ways as opposed to perpetuating this addiction? And that's the same with money, power, status, all those things. All of us, of course, want to have ample money, but we certainly know people who have so much money and they have more and more and actually on a deep level feel very, very empty. And that often happens if there isn't the flow. If so much is coming in, because money is a form of light, right? And the light comes in and we as human beings are the vessel. We encapsulate the light. If our vessel isn't big enough to hold all the light, the vessel bursts. So people sometimes will have so much money and then go into a super, super deep depression and get suicidal. And I've certainly treated many people like that. And then you teach people to enhance their vessel and also to create flow. How do you then use your abundance in the service of others? I think that's another huge part of an abundant life is that purpose and mission is to be of service to others in some way, shape, or form. It's almost a moral obligation if you have great abundance to figure out in some way how to create that flow and to be of service and help others who are less fortunate.
Yeah.
So, and then I wanted just to comment on one other thing. Addiction is a form of escape, and escape as being one of the less constructive ways to deal with our emotions.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's 4 different ways. And it's David Hawkins' book, Letting Go, that talks about the different forms of processing our emotions. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. And so let me tell you about them and let me tell you specifically about letting go, which is the most constructive way. Please. So one is escape. Right. So this is when we have addictions and we're feeling an emotion we don't want to feel. It's scary. It's uncomfortable. And so we have a glass of wine or we go straight to work or we check our phones. And what that does is it temporarily pushes off some of the energy of that emotion without really enabling us to metabolize, process it, and let it go. So escapes certainly are in the short term effective, but in the long term, not the most effective. So that's addiction and escape is one form of processing.
Right.
Emotion.
It's a temporary solution, but it's not actually resolving any of the underlying source.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then expression, talking to your coach, talking to your therapist, another form of processing emotions, also constructive and good. The third form, but not the best. So expression, escape. And then the third form is repression and suppression. So suppression is taking your emotions and sublimate or channeling them, such as sublimating them into something more constructive. Like if you have a lot of anger and aggression, you might you'll become a surgeon or you'll go boxing, something like that. Or you'll repress it, meaning that the anxiety associated with that emotion is so high that it doesn't even come into your conscious awareness, that you just repress it and essentially push it away without even realizing that you have that emotion.
Right.
And then it comes out in all these other ways. Like you'll be angry at something your boss said to you. You're not even aware fully of the anger. Then you'll snap at your child, something like that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And then the fourth way and most constructive way is letting go. And that is when an emotion comes through you and you let yourself feel the emotion fully and completely without doing anything to push the emotion away or bring it back in. And you allow the emotion to sort of be, and for you to be with it without judgment, without commentary, and essentially allow the emotion to work its way through you and eventually to let go. And that is, according to David Hawkins, the most constructive way of processing emotions. The other three are okay, but the most constructive is the letting go method.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I actually had an experience like that recently. And in that process of, I think you're so right. So first of all, I just want to kind of recapture what you just said. So I love that definition of addiction, which is the more of something you have, the emptier you feel. I mean, that is so well put. And, you know, it's so true that, you know, I often wonder, like, somewhere deep down, we all know that just achieving more status, just having more money, like these things alone are not going to give us what we act like they're going to give us. Right. I mean, I've met so many people in my life who are just behaving as though more money is going to magically trickle down and just solve all the other, or achieve all the other deeper desires. But that's just not the way it is. However, we behave this way. And so I love that definition because it really strikes at the heart of it. And then these 4 ways of processing emotions are very true. And the letting go one. So do you think this is true? I feel like sitting with emotions and learning to not judge them. Like for me personally, I used to do this all the time and drive myself crazy. I would start to feel upset or anxious or angry or whatever, some emotion I didn't want to feel. And then I would mentally start to reject it. Like, no, I don't want to feel this way. But it only exacerbated the feeling, right? The opposite, where an emotion comes, it doesn't feel good, but just what I've tried to do is I acknowledge that, you know, there's a reason this is here. I wonder why it's here. But either way, it's here, and it's okay that it's here, and it's supposed to be here. And what I feel like happens, and I'd love your feedback on this, what I feel like happens is that process of sitting with and just allowing kicks in some sort of deeper understanding. And what it feels like is I know that there's a lesson here, or there's something that it's, you know, that this emotion's there for a reason, and there's something that I can take away from it. But I have to sit with it to allow myself to, you know, kind of discover what there is to discover. So that's been my experience. What's your reaction to that? Do you find that?
Yeah,
do you have a different?
Absolutely. I think that you're exactly right, that there's always, you know, and even in our mind, it's like what you said, that when an emotion comes up, especially if it's a difficult emotion, we will have one of two primary things. Either I don't want to feel this, stop feeling, or what's the lesson here? Like we go straight to the lesson, you know, like let me extract the diamond. And that's just us being human beings, and how hard it is sometimes just to be, that we want to do, we want to analyze, we want to get the meaning, we want to get to the finish line. What is this all about? And I don't want to feel this. I don't want to feel something that's going to make me angry or sad or start crying, and that's just part of being human. And then when we could say, you know what, it's all part of being human, and all the emotions are beautiful, even though we know some emotions are very difficult to feel. Pain is very difficult to feel, but it's like a higher level is recognizing that all emotions, including pain, are part of the joy of life. And that's part of the beauty of life, is being able to have all, you know, the seasons of our lives, all the seasons of our feelings and emotions. And of course, we might prefer one versus the other, but just being able to go with the vicissitudes of life and be as opposed to having to control it and always be doing.
Totally. Yeah. And as you know, for the achievers that are listening to this, and I would certainly put myself in that category, trying to achieve some outcome against a negative feeling, like let's knock this out. Let's what's going on here? What's the lesson?
Great. I'm having an emotion. Oh my God. Okay. Yeah.
What's the lesson? And the thing is that is kind of what I've realized, at least for myself, is that inadvertently or unconsciously, what I'm really doing is I'm just saying, let's get to the other side of this, like fast, which is just another form of not letting it be. And so trying to kind of conquer it, or, how's this going to make me stronger or whatever, is really just in some ways an avoidance mechanism, or at least it has been for me. So, all right. So let's continue our path back towards abundance. And I know that you mentioned this earlier, but psychedelics are something that have come into your world or your interest. And you're really a vanguard. I mean, you have a depth of knowledge on this topic. So where did you first become curious or interested about psychedelics? And can you just talk a little bit about your perspective on the current Renaissance we're experiencing? I'm actually in Maryland, and Baltimore, Maryland, and Johns Hopkins University is here. And Roland Griffiths, as I'm sure you know, he really started a lot of research on psilocybin and so on and so forth. So
yeah. Psychedelics. I remember way before psychedelics were as popular as they are now, maybe like 10 years ago, a friend saying, oh, there's these things called journeys. We should experience that. I was like, what's a journey? And just such a curiosity and having no insight whatsoever. So many years later, I've had my own experiences with journeys that have been really profound and remarkable. So I feel I consider myself a psychonaut. And also I've had so many patients who have had experiences and have gotten really into the research. And the person who I'm co-founding my mental health and spirituality center at Yale is the head of the psychedelics research program at Yale. And so psychedelics are also going to be a part of the mental health and spirituality center, the spiritual side of the psychedelic use. To me, psychedelics are so interesting because I feel that they unify mind, body, and spirit. They obviously have a very powerful and potent neurobiological basis, which is what all the research has been done on. And I want to include also ketamine in this idea of psychedelics. That's the closest thing we have to a legal psychedelic. And now also psilocybin is becoming legal, decriminalized in certain states. So soon people will be able to also use psilocybin. And then there's other parts of the world where, for instance, ayahuasca is legal. And, there's a medically based legal clinic in Costa Rica called Rhythmia, where they actually have ayahuasca ceremonies, and that's been cleared with the government. So there are other places of the world. And there's also places I've had some of my patients go to all different places of the world. There are psilocybin clinics that have been legal for a long time in the Netherlands. So this is happening.
So when we talk about psychedelics, let's just maybe set up a baseline here. What you mentioned a few.
Yeah. So
let's go into the category.
Yeah, exactly. For our purposes of our discussion, let's assume psychedelics, whether ketamine is a psychedelic, it kind of depends on who you ask. We're going to include that. So ketamine, psilocybin and MDMA, extensive research in our country being done. Soon both will be legalized. Psilocybin already is legal and decriminalized in certain states. And then there's other things that you can include, which are not yet legal, but where probably there's going to be research and which are legal in other parts of the world, such as ayahuasca, like I mentioned. And then there's things like LSD, peyote, and much, much more. That's just, a small sampling. But there's also this distinction between natural medicines or plant medicines and man-made compounds and substances. Ketamine and LSD are the man-made substances. And then there's a lot of plant medicines like ayahuasca, like psilocybin, though there is a form of psilocybin that is now man-made. So, and there's actually arguments for why we want to use man-made compounds over the natural plant medicines in order not to, they say, rape the earth, to not be able to exploit the earth, especially with more and more people being able to harness the positive benefits of these substances. And what I find so compelling about psychedelics, including ketamine, which is now legal. Ketamine is the legal psychedelic in this country. And ketamine has been shown to be really effective for anxiety, for depression, for addiction, for PTSD. Sometimes I just had a patient who was using it for OCD and it was effective for that, but not always for OCD. So it's just really amazing because not only do psychedelics offer a wholly novel neurobiological mechanism that our profession of psychiatry has not seen in many, many years. Like the majority of medications we have in psychiatry, we have, your SSRIs, your Prozac, your Zoloft, your Lexapro, Celexa, and you have a few other medications, but nothing really new in a long time. And this is a completely novel mechanism. So this is offering benefit in a way that things haven't for a very long time. So that's number one. The other part is that oftentimes, not always, you can be taking, these psychedelics subperceptually, and people are often microdosing. We can talk about microdosing and what that means. You could be taking them subperceptually to microdose for anxiety, depression, to improve your cognitive performance. Or you could be taking them at a level where they actually alter your perception. So you have a little bit of a journey experience. And that's the case with psilocybin, MDMA, with ketamine, certainly with ayahuasca. And so what often happens in those cases is not just that you have the neurobiological effect of this medicine on your heart and mind, but you also have something happen that changes how you perceive the world. And that perceptual experience could be so profound and has led people to, for instance, start to see their life in a wholly different way, start to not fear death if before they have feared death, start to believe that there is a higher power if they have before been atheists. And I don't necessarily mean believe in God, but believe that there is something greater. Start to be able to release their trauma and reprocess their trauma in a constructive way when they haven't been able to do this for 10, 20 some odd years as a veteran. So these are very, very powerful medicines, not just because of their neurobiological basis, but because of the meaning making or spiritual, mystical, or sometimes dissociative experience that accompanies them.
Okay. So a couple questions. Number one, for someone who's unfamiliar with this, who's never done any psychedelics, there's a Netflix series and there's a book by Michael Pollan that I've really enjoyed, and I recommend to people as for beginners. I guess the question for you I would have is, what are the biggest misconceptions about psychedelics? And
I think that's a great question. And I think the misconceptions come from a lot of fears about something new being introduced, and especially something new that is really taking our nation by storm, especially if we're thinking about treating some very vulnerable populations with these substances, such as people with PTSD, anxiety, depression, addiction, trauma, things like that. So it comes from a place of fear. So one misconception is that these substances can be highly addictive. And for the most part, with none of these substances has addiction been shown to be a really, really large issue. Now, there are noted cases of that. Especially, with ketamine, I've heard of a few cases, but by no means is that the norm or common. And actually, ketamine has been shown to really help people with certain addictions and to reduce, for instance, the number of heavy drinking days in individuals who are alcoholics and to help people with other forms of addiction. And similarly, psilocybin, like these drugs do not have much addictive potential really at all. And on the contrary, they really help people with addiction. So that's, I think, one of the fears and misconceptions because the scientific data does not support that. The second misconception is you're going to lose your mind. You're going to go on some sort of journey experience to some other far off place. You're never going to be the same. It's going to be terrifying. And it actually can make you much worse than better.
Yeah. And or that it can induce psychosis. That's one of the stories,
yes,
right? Which, I mean, a lot of this does harken back to the kind of the horror stories that were told after the acid test and the 70s.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so those sorts of worries are not unfounded. And that's why it's so important to actually really screen the people who are using these substances very carefully. Because if you do have a past history of psychosis or a family history of psychosis, you have to be very, very careful or actually not use something like psilocybin. If you have a past history of bipolarity and are prone to mania, you have to be very careful and not use certain certain psychedelics, which can bring that on.
Given that this is going to be part of your focus, or at least a part of the conversation, part of the work that you're going to do at the center, what do you view as who is this right for? I guess one, and what are the main benefits that you're hoping to either explore more or offer access to, or what have you through the center?
Yeah, absolutely. And so a lot of this research is already being done at Yale in all different ways. Dr. Pittenger is doing research on OCD with psilocybin. Dr. Crystal, who is the chair of the department, was one of the first people to do research on ketamine. And he's the reason we have all these ketamine clinics all over the world. He's the one that actually showed that ketamine has a very strong antidepressant effect. And so ketamine is used, it's FDA approved for pain, but it's used off label to treat treatment-resistant depression. So individuals who have tried many different things, but they have been ineffective, ketamine is one of those things that could actually really help for people who've not found relief elsewhere. But also some people with anxiety, with addiction, with PTSD could also, and PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. So people with trauma that's been difficult to work through. Ketamine has been helpful for that. For MDMA, the research on that is primarily in the realm of trauma, but also for deep connections and couples therapy. There are places in the world. So I heard Rick Doblin, who's head of MAPS. MAPS is the organization that is doing all the studies to legalize MDMA. And according to Rick Doblin, probably by the end of 2024, you will be able to have a session with a trained therapist who can administer to you MDMA if you have a history of trauma. But MDMA or ecstasy is something that also has been used or proposed for couples therapies, and also where there is conflict. So war-torn regions or conflict between, for instance, the Israelis and Palestinians, being able to have these people use some MDMA and then come to each other with a fully open heart. And it's a really, really potent, powerful idea to be able to use a medication, a medicine like that in that kind of setting and enable people to achieve results and ends that they otherwise wouldn't be able to achieve strictly through human connection. And that's what the MDMA does. It opens your heart and enables you to feel love. And it enables you to feel deep, deep connection that makes people better people, as Paul Stamets, one of the proponents of psilocybin, says. So that's what's on the pipeline right now. And we hope at the Yale Center to study all the different facets of that, and especially the spiritual side of psychedelics. And you're, at Johns Hopkins, so Roland Griffith and now David Yaden are the pioneers for that, looking at how, in particular, some of these medicines enable people to see the world anew and the kind of spiritual experiences and mystical experiences that derive as a function from that and how that changes people's lives.
All right. So maybe what we could bookend this conversation, or at least this chapter of this conversation, with a reflection just back on this concept that you brought up earlier, because I don't know, in everything that you and I have talked about, that I have experienced, that I've learned, like a lot of these compounds are helping people to, as you said, feel more connected, not only with other people, but with themselves and with, something greater, with the world, with their life. You mentioned earlier this concept of heart opening, and my intuition is that a lot of what's in your book, a lot of the work that I've heard you describe doing even psychedelics, all have the ability to potentiate heart opening. So if that was an orientation of life that was worth pursuing, and tell me if you agree with that or not, how would you describe what that means? And how would you describe the value or worthwhileness of that pursuit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's such a great question. And I love that question because I feel as though heart opening has been what I have been doing in my own life and with my patients and clients from day one, even way before psychedelics. And then suddenly psychedelics, especially MDMA, come into the picture. And also psilocybin has heart opening properties, but enable people to feel these deep heart opening experiences. And I would say that, and I've also had as a psychonaut those experiences, and it just opens your heart and you feel deep, deep love for the world, for yourself. And it enables you temporarily to reconceptualize the things that you once worried about. Like I feel that what happens if I have that substance in my system is that I feel all of the things that I worry about, almost like my mind shuts down and I see so much more clearly what is right and what are just the toilings of my mind. And what is always right is that love conquers all. And, you have a lot of spiritual teachings that teach about aligning with love and living from that space of love and being able to see everybody from that lens. But it's very hard if you're living in this everyday world and don't necessarily have a spiritual practice to know what that feels like. And it's MDMA that can open and enable people to really know what that feels like on a personal and experiential level. And what you're given when you have that kind of experience is this idea of gratuitous grace, right? You're given this glimpse, this momentary glimpse into this amazing universe. It's not something that stays with you unless you do really, really hard work to learn how to keep your heart open in your everyday life before and after this. So that takes a lot of spiritual practice through learning, through meditation, through heart opening exercises, through yoga and Kundalini, whatever that is. There are practices that help you open your heart. And those practices are often much more subtle than what you get from like the huge heart opening experience of an MDMA journey. But that perspective is often so potent that it then reconceptualizes everything else in your life. It broadens your perspective. You're shown that, oh my goodness, when my heart is fully open, I'm able to see the world like this. And it creates this anchor point and like this light that you can move towards in the rest of your life. So it's really this gratuitous grace. It's something that you're given as a gift, as a very powerful perspective that then you can use as a beacon of light to move towards in the rest of your life.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because I do think that this whole idea of steps that we can take to open our hearts, to see the world with less judgment, to see the world with more compassion, that's a beautiful thing. Anna, are there any final words that you would have for the audience as we close here about, something that they could take away or start to inquire within themselves to evaluate kind of where they are and what would be a beautiful next step?
Yeah. I mean, I love just a little exercise of looking within and just asking yourself that question, posing a question to your soul. What do you most deeply want? And to ask yourself that question whenever you have a chance throughout the day, because sometimes we're living a life, and when we don't ask that question, we go into autopilot and we forget to check in with what our soul really needs on the deepest level. And so if you start asking just, what do I most deeply want throughout the day, and see what comes up and honor anything and everything that comes up. And in doing so, it's like a form of priming your soul and priming your mind. And the answer can come in a dream. It can come in a craving. It can come as a thought in the middle of nowhere. And just be open to how the answers will present.
I like that. I love that. I love that because you can use it every day and many times a day. And what a great pattern. What a great habit to adopt, and something to help recenter and realign. Where can people find out more about you and more about the center? Where should people connect with you?
Sure. You can find more out about me on my website, www.annayusim.com. And the center, we're going to have a website soon on the Yale website connected to our center, which will link to my website. And please reach out.
Thank you so much. And I'll also just mention your book, which is absolutely wonderful and is filled with exercises. I love at the end of each chapter of your book, you included a really beautiful exercise of how to connect with the topic of the chapter. And so that book, for anyone listening, is called Fulfilled: How the Science of Spirituality Can Have You Live a Happier, More Meaningful Life. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Nate. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks for checking out this video. Make sure you hit subscribe. I'm Nathan Hurd, also known as The Rich Life Guy. You can follow me at The Rich Life Guy. Also check out Rich Life Lab, which is the podcast available everywhere. And leave a comment and let me know if this video landed for you or what else you'd like to hear from me in the future. Thank you so much.